The Nebraska plains stretched endlessly beneath a leaden sky, the late winter of 1876 bearing down upon the land with merciless cold. The grass, once golden and alive with summer's warmth, now lay brittle and frost-bitten, crunching beneath worn boots like broken glass. Wind swept across the flatlands with a mournful howl, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Clara Morrison pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers numb despite the wool. Beside her, 7-year-old Thomas stumbled along, his small hand clutched desperately in hers. The boy's lips had turned a worrying shade of blue, but he hadn't complained once in the past 3 days of walking. He was his father's son in that way, stubborn and brave beyond his years. "Mama, are we almost there?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. Clara's heart clenched. She didn't know where there was anymore. They'd been wandering since the bank took their small homestead 2 weeks ago, moving from town to town, searching for work, for charity, for any scrap of hope. Their last meal had been yesterday morning, a crust of bread shared between them from a kind woman in the last settlement. "Soon, my love," she whispered, the lie burning her throat. Just a little farther. The horizon offered no comfort, no sign of shelter or civilization, just endless grass and sky, both the color of old pewter. Clara's legs trembled with each step, weakness spreading through her body like poison. She'd given Thomas the last of their water that morning, and her own throat felt like sand. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it a new chill that cut through their meager clothing like knives. Clara looked up at the sky and felt her heart sink. The clouds had taken on an ominous darkness, rolling in from the north with frightening speed. She'd lived on the frontier long enough to know what those clouds meant. "Thomas, we need to find shelter," she said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. But there was nowhere to go. No trees, no rocks, no abandoned soddy, nothing but grass as far as the eye could see. The first snowflakes began to fall, fat and heavy, quickly obscuring their vision. Within minutes, the storm was upon them in full force. The wind screamed around them, driving snow horizontally across the plains. Clara could barely see 3 feet ahead. She pulled Thomas against her, trying to shield him with her body, but she knew it was futile. They were exposed, vulnerable as newborn calves in a wolf pack's territory. Her legs gave out first. One moment she was walking, the next she was on her knees in the snow, Thomas crying out in alarm. She tried to stand, but her body wouldn't obey. The cold had seeped too deep, stolen too much. "Mama, Mama, get up!" Thomas tugged at her arm, tears freezing on his cheeks. Clara managed to pull him close, wrapping her arms around him as they huddled in the snow. "Listen to me, Thomas," she said, her voice slurring with cold and exhaustion. "You're going to be all right. You're strong, like your papa was strong." "I don't want to be strong," Thomas sobbed. "I want you to get up. We just need one more night," Clara whispered, her eyes growing heavy. The cold didn't seem so bad now, almost warm, really. Just one more night, and then... Her voice trailed off as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. She felt Thomas shaking her, heard him calling for her, but it all seemed very far away. The last thing she was aware of was the sound, a rhythmic pounding that didn't belong to the storm. Hoofbeats? Luke Callahan had been riding hard for 2 hours, racing the storm back to his ranch. He'd stayed too long in town, finalizing the sale of 50 head of cattle, and now he was paying for it. His stallion, Tempest, plowed through the mounting snow with determination, but Luke knew they were still miles from home. He was just considering whether to push on or find somewhere to wait out the worst of it when Tempest suddenly veered, whinnying in alarm. Luke squinted through the driving snow, trying to see what had spooked his horse. There, dark shapes against the white. His first thought was wolves or a dead animal, but as he drew closer, his blood ran cold. It was a woman and a child, huddled together in the snow. Luke dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots sinking deep as he rushed to them. The woman was unconscious, her skin pale as porcelain. But when he pressed his fingers to her neck, he felt a pulse, weak, but there. The boy was conscious but barely, his eyes glazed with cold and fear. "Help," the child whispered. "Please help my mama." Luke didn't waste time on words. He scooped the woman into his arms, shocked at how light she was, nothing but bones beneath a thin dress and shawl. A starving widow collapsed on the plains, he murmured to himself, the words carried away by the wind. "Can you hold on to my neck?" he asked the boy, who nodded weakly. Luke positioned the child on his back, then carefully mounted Tempest with the woman cradled against his chest. It was awkward and dangerous in the storm, but leaving them meant certain death. "Hold tight, boy," Luke commanded, wrapping one arm securely around the woman while gripping the reins with his other hand. "We're going home." Tempest seemed to understand the urgency, picking his way carefully but quickly through the storm. Luke pulled his duster around the woman as best he could, trying to share what warmth he had. She stirred slightly against him, mumbling something he couldn't make out. The ride seemed endless. The storm grew worse, visibility dropping to nearly nothing. Luke trusted Tempest's instincts, knowing the horse could find his way home even blind. The boy's grip on his neck loosened several times, and Luke had to bark sharp commands to keep him conscious. "What's your name? Son," he called over his shoulder. Thomas," came the weak reply. "Well, Thomas, I need you to keep talking to me. Tell me about your mama." She's good. She sings sometimes. Not lately, though." "What happened to your PA?" "Tree fell on him last spring. Mama cried for days." Luke's jaw tightened. "A widow? Then, trying to survive on the frontier with a young child. He'd seen it too many times, families destroyed by the harsh realities of Western life. Women and children left to fend for themselves in a land that showed no mercy. Finally, through the white chaos, Luke spotted the dark silhouette of his ranch buildings. The main house stood solid against the storm, smoke still rising from the chimney. He'd never been so glad to see home. He rode straight to the front porch, shouting for his ranch hands. "Miguel, Sam, get out here!" The door burst open, and his foreman, Miguel, appeared, taking in the situation with one glance. Together, they got the woman and boy inside, carrying them straight to the parlor where the fire burned hottest. "Senor Luke, who are they?" Miguel asked as they laid the woman on the sofa. "Found them in the storm," Luke said shortly, already working to remove the woman's snow-crusted shawl. "Get warm blankets, quickly, and heat some broth, not too hot. Sam, ride for Doc Patterson." "In this storm, boss?" Sam hesitated at the door. "Take the covered sledge. These two won't make it without help." As his men scattered to their tasks, Luke knelt beside the sofa, studying the woman's face in the firelight. Even unconscious and half-frozen, there was a strength to her features. High cheekbones, a determined jaw. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, spreading across the cushions like spilled ink. Thomas sat huddled by the fire, shivering violently despite the warmth. Luke grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. "Your mama's going to be all right," he said, hoping it wasn't a lie. "We're going to take care of both of you." The boy looked up at him with eyes too old for his age. "She said we just needed one more night. She kept saying that." Luke's throat tightened. One more night. How many nights had they been out there, surviving on hope and determination alone? He looked back at the woman, this stranger who'd collapsed on his land, whom fate or chance had placed in his path. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the thick walls of the ranch house, warmth and safety held sway. Luke Callahan had built his fortune through cattle and careful investment, but as he watched the color slowly return to the woman's cheeks, he wondered if perhaps he'd just made his most valuable acquisition yet, not of land or livestock, but of 2 lives saved from the merciless plains. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight as Clara Morrison began to stir, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of prairie sky after rain. She would wake to a new world, Luke thought, one where she and her boy were safe, at least for now. What would come after? Only time would tell. Luke's ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Nebraska grassland. The buildings clustered like a small town against the vastness of the plains. The main house stood 2 stories tall, built of sturdy timber hauled from the distant Black Hills. Its wraparound porch a testament to prosperity in a land where most made do with sod houses. Behind it, the massive barn sheltered prize breeding stock, while the bunkhouse, smokehouse, and various outbuildings spoke of a well-run operation that employed over 20 men. Clara woke slowly, consciousness returning in fragments. First came warmth, real warmth, not the false comfort that preceded freezing, then softness beneath her, the crackle of a fire, and the smell of something savory that made her empty stomach clench painfully. Her eyes opened to an unfamiliar ceiling, painted white and clean, with proper boards instead of the sad canvas and dirt she'd grown accustomed to in their failed homestead. Panic seized her. Where was Thomas? She tried to sit up, but the room spun violently. A firm hand pressed her shoulder back down. Easy there, ma'am. Your boy's safe. He's right here. Clara turned her head to see a man sitting in a chair beside the sofa, tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered features and eyes the color of good coffee. Thomas was curled in another chair by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sleeping soundly. Where am I? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Luke Callahan's ranch, about 15 miles south of Willow Creek. Found you and the boy in the storm yesterday. You've been sleeping near on 18 hours. Yesterday, the memories rushed back. The endless walking, the storm, the moment when her body simply couldn't continue. She should feel grateful, but mostly she felt wary. She'd learned the hard way that kindness from strange men often came with expectations. I should go, she said, attempting to rise again. Luke didn't touch her this time, but his voice held firm authority. Ma'am, there's 3 feet of snow outside and more coming. You're in no condition to go anywhere, and neither is your boy. You need food and rest. As if summoned by his words, an older Mexican woman appeared carrying a tray. Ah, Senora, you are awake. Good, good. You must eat. The smell of beef broth nearly undid Clara's composure. When had she last tasted meat? The woman, introduced as Rosa, Luke's housekeeper, helped prop her up with pillows and placed the tray across her lap. Clara's hands shook as she lifted the spoon. Slowly, Luke cautioned, Your stomach won't thank you for rushing. Pride warred with need, and need won. Clara sipped the broth, closing her eyes as warmth spread through her body. She was acutely aware of Luke watching her, cataloging her worn dress, her chapped hands, the way she tried to eat with dignity despite her hunger. What's your name? He asked when she'd managed half the bowl. Clara Morrison. She saw no point in lying. Where were you headed? Anywhere there might be work. She met his gaze directly. My husband died last spring. We lost our homestead to the bank 2 weeks ago. Luke nodded. No surprise on his face. It was an old story on the frontier. You have people somewhere? Family? No. The word sat heavy between them. Thomas stirred then, whimpering in his sleep. Clara tried to go to him, but Luke was already there, adjusting the boy's blankets with surprising gentleness. Let him sleep, he said. Rosa fed him earlier, ate like he hadn't seen food in days. Because he hadn't. Clara thought but didn't say. She'd given him everything she could find, going without herself more often than not. The next days passed in a blur of recovery. The storm raged for 3 more days, sealing them inside the ranch house like a snow globe. Clara grew stronger on Rosa's cooking. Simple, hearty fare that put flesh back on her bones. Thomas, with the resilience of childhood, bounced back quickly, his natural curiosity overcoming his initial shyness. Luke proved to be a confusing host. He was unfailingly polite, but kept a careful distance. He didn't hover or make her feel beholden, simply ensured she and Thomas had everything they needed. She learned from Rosa that he was 32, had built his fortune through smart cattle deals and an uncanny ability to read weather and market trends, and had never married. "Why?" Clara asked, then blushed at her boldness. Rosa shrugged. "Senor Luke, he is particular. Many ladies from town try to catch his eye, but he says he has no time for silly women who would faint at the sight of a branding iron." On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Clara stood at the parlor window, watching the sun transform the snow-covered plains into a glittering wonderland. Beautiful but treacherous, like everything in this hard country. "It's something, isn't it?" Luke's voice came from behind her. "It's the same snow that nearly killed us," she said quietly. "The land doesn't care one way or another. It just is. We're the ones who decide if we're going to survive it or let it beat us." Clara turned to study him, spoken like someone who's never been beaten. "You'd be wrong about that." His expression darkened briefly. "Lost my parents to cholera when I was 15. Worked other men's cattle for 10 years before I could buy my first piece of land. I know what it's like to have nothing but determination." Thomas ran into the room then, breaking the moment. "Mr. Luke, Miguel says I can see the horses if you say it's all right." Luke's face softened in a way Clara hadn't seen before. "If your mother agrees." Clara nodded, and Thomas whooped with joy. As Luke led him away, she heard her son chattering excitedly about horses and cattle and all the things he'd been learning from the ranch hands. That evening, Luke made an offer. "Stay through the winter," he said simply, as they sat by the fire after Thomas had gone to bed. "I need a housekeeper. Rosa's getting on in years and could use the help. Room, board, and wages." Clara's pride flared immediately. "I don't need charity, Mr. Callahan." "It's not charity. It's a business arrangement. You need work and shelter." "I need help," seemed straightforward to me. "People will talk." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Luke's expression hardened slightly. "People always talk. Question is whether you're going to let their opinions matter more than your boy's welfare." It was a sharp truth, cutting through her defenses. Clara thought of Thomas, already looking healthier after just a few days of regular meals. Thought of the alternatives. More wandering, more hunger, more uncertainty. What exactly would my duties be? Help Rosa with the household management, cooking, cleaning, tending the kitchen garden come spring. Nothing you haven't done before. I'd wager. And Thomas. He's welcome to join the ranch school. I run one for the Hands children. My foreman's wife teaches them letters and numbers. It was more than fair. It was generous, which made Clara even more suspicious. In her experience, generous men expected payment in other currencies. As if reading her thoughts, Luke added, "Your room would be on the second floor, next to Rosa's. There's a lock on the door, and you'd have my word as a gentleman that you'll be treated with nothing but respect under this roof." Clara searched his face, looking for deception, for hidden intentions. She found only steady honesty and perhaps a hint of understanding. "Through winter," she agreed finally. "Come spring, we'll see." Luke nodded and extended his hand to shake on it, treating her like an equal. A business partner, his hand was calloused and warm, swallowing hers completely, but gentle in its strength. That night, Clara lay in a proper bed for the first time in months. Thomas sleeping peacefully in a small bed Rosa had set up in her room. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside, they were safe, warm, fed. She thought of Luke's words about the land not caring, about deciding whether to survive or be beaten. For the first time since James had died, Clara felt something besides despair and exhaustion. It might have been hope, though she was almost afraid to name it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning her duties, facing the ranch hand's curiosity, managing the strange awareness she felt around Luke Callahan. But tonight, she and Thomas were safe. Tonight, that was enough. The moon rose over the snow-covered plains, casting silver light through her window, somewhere in the house. She heard Luke's steady footsteps as he made his final rounds. Checking locks, banking fires, a protector, she realized. A man who gathered the lost and vulnerable under his roof as naturally as he gathered cattle into his herds. Clara Morrison had collapsed on the plains as a desperate widow with nothing but the clothes on her back. But perhaps, just perhaps, Luke Callahan had carried her not just to shelter, but to a new beginning. Only time would tell if she had the courage to accept it. Spring came slowly to the Nebraska plains, arriving in fits and starts like a hesitant visitor. The snow melted gradually, revealing brown grass beneath, and the frozen earth turned to mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. The Platte River, locked in ice through the long winter, began to flow again, its waters swollen with snowmelt. Clara stood at the kitchen window, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency, watching the transformation outside. 3 months had passed since Luke Callahan had carried her through the blizzard, and in that time, her world had shifted as dramatically as the seasons. Her hands, once cracked and bleeding from cold, had healed. Her face had filled out, losing the gaunt desperation that had haunted her reflection. But it was the deeper changes that unsettled her most. The way her heart lightened when she heard Luke's boots on the porch, how naturally she'd fallen into the rhythm of ranch life, the dangerous feeling of belonging that crept in during unguarded moments. "Mama, look what I can do," Thomas's voice carried across the yard where he sat atop a gentle mare named Buttercup, Miguel holding the lead rope. Her son's face glowed with pride and joy, expressions she hadn't seen since before James died. The ranch had been good for him. Too good, perhaps. What would happen when they had to leave? Because they would have to leave. Clara reminded herself of this daily, even as the thought grew harder to bear. The memories came unbidden as she worked the dough. James's laughing eyes the day they'd married, full of dreams about their western adventure. His strong hands building their little soddy, so proud of every crooked wall. The terrible sound of splitting wood, the massive pine coming down wrong, too fast, his body beneath the trunk, legs crushed beyond repair. 3 days he'd lingered, fever taking him piece by piece while she held his hand and pretended they'd be fine. After the burial, James's brother Seth had arrived to help. She could still feel his whiskey breath on her neck, his hands grabbing where they shouldn't. "Pretty widow like you needs a man's protection." He'd slurred. When she'd refused him, he'd turned the family against her, spinning tales about her character. The bank had been all too willing to foreclose after that, eager to sell the land to more respectable folks. "You're going to work that dough into leather if you keep at it like that." Clara startled. Luke stood in the doorway, hat in hand, a bemused expression on his face. She looked down to find she'd been kneading with unnecessary violence. "I was thinking," she said, forcing her hands to gentle. "Dangerous habit," he replied, but his eyes were kind. Luke had a way of reading her moods without prying, offering steady presence when the memories grew too heavy. Through the window, they watched Thomas successfully guide Buttercup in a wide circle, whooping with delight. Miguel grinned up at the boy, teaching him to neck rein with patient instruction. "He's taking to it like he was born in the saddle," Luke observed. His father would have been proud. The words slipped out before Clara could stop them. "Tell me about him." It wasn't a command, just an invitation. Clara shaped the dough into loaves as she spoke, finding it easier to talk without meeting Luke's eyes. James Morrison was a dreamer, thought the frontier would make us rich, give us a life we couldn't have back in Ohio. He was so certain, so eager. I loved that about him, his faith that tomorrow would always be better than today. But tomorrow wasn't better. "No." She set the loaves aside to rise. The land was harder than he expected, drier. The crops failed 2 years running. He took work at a logging camp to make ends meet, said it was just temporary. Luke waited through her pause, patient as always. "A widow's story isn't unique out here," Clara finished, wiping her hands on her apron. "The land takes what it wants. The land takes." Luke agreed quietly. "But sometimes it gives back too." Their eyes met and held for a moment before Clara looked away, unsettled by the warmth she found there. She busied herself with unnecessary tidying until Luke cleared his throat. "There's talk in town," he said carefully, "about you being here." Clara's hand stilled. She'd known this was coming, had seen it in the looks from the supply wagon drivers, the whispers that stopped when she entered the general store on the few occasions she'd accompanied Rosa to town. What kind of talk? The usual small-minded gossip. Some folks think it's improper, a widow living under a bachelor's roof. And what do you think? Luke's jaw tightened. I think those folks have too much time on their hands and not enough Christian charity in their hearts. But I wanted you to know, in case it makes you uncomfortable, I could arrange other accommodations if— No. The word came out fiercer than Clara intended. That is— Thomas is happy here. I won't uproot him because of wagging tongues. Luke nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Good. Rosa would skin me alive if I let you go anyway. Says you're the best help she's ever had. As he turned to leave, Clara found herself calling after him. Luke! He paused, looking back. Thank you for warning me, and for not being like other men. Something shifted in his expression. A flash of emotion quickly controlled. You've had enough men trying to take advantage. I reckon you'll get no trouble from me. Clara, you have my word on that. After he left, Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her heart beating too fast. She'd spoken truth. Luke wasn't like other men. He asked nothing improper, made no suggestive comments, never let his hands linger when helping her down from a wagon. Yet there was something in his eyes when he watched her work, a loneliness that matched her own. The next weeks brought the full glory of prairie spring. Wildflowers carpeted the grasslands in purple and yellow. Calves dropped in the pastures, their wobbly legs finding strength quickly. The ranch hummed with activity as the men prepared for spring roundup. Clara and Thomas fell deeper into ranch rhythms. She learned to plan meals for 30 hungry cowboys, to treat minor injuries with Rosa's herbal remedies, to read the weather in cloud formations. Thomas spent every free moment with the horses, absorbing Miguel's lessons like a sponge. His Spanish was getting better than his English, much to everyone's amusement. The closeness between Clara and Luke grew slowly, built on shared meals and evening conversations by the fire. He told her about building his empire from nothing, the calculated risks that had paid off, the loneliness of success with no one to share it. She found herself sharing more too. Funny stories about James, her fears for Thomas, even her love of books, which led Luke to unlock his study library for her use. One evening, as Clara mended clothes by lamplight, Luke worked on ranch accounts at his desk. Thomas lay on the rug between them, drawing pictures of horses with charcoal on brown paper. It was dangerously domestic, painfully sweet. Clara caught herself imagining this as her life, not a temporary arrangement, but something permanent. The thought terrified her. There's a barn dance Saturday next, Luke said suddenly. The whole county comes. You and Thomas should attend. Clara's needle paused. I don't think that's wise, given the talk. Let them see you have nothing to hide. Luke countered. Besides, Thomas would enjoy the music. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses made Luke frown. Visitors after dark were rarely good news. He rose, strapping on his gun belt with practiced ease. Stay inside, he ordered, heading for the door. Clara moved to the window, watching as 3 riders dismounted in the yard. Her blood turned to ice when lamplight from the porch illuminated their faces. Seth Morrison, James's brother, stood at the front of the group. Evening, Callahan. Seth's voice carried clearly. Heard you've been harboring my sister-in-law. Mrs. Morrison is employed here. Luke replied evenly. What's your business? Family business. See, Clara there ran off with my nephew without so much as a by your leave. His father's kin have rights. Clara's hands clenched the curtain. Rights. As if Thomas were property to be claimed. The boy is with his mother, where he belongs, Luke stated. Seth spat tobacco juice near Luke's boots. That's debatable. Woman like her, living in sin with a man she ain't married to, judge might see different about what's best for the boy. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her knees weaken. They could take Thomas. In this world where men made laws and women had few rights, They could actually take her son. Luke stepped forward, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You're on my land, Morrison. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." "No need for threats," Seth said. But he stepped back. "Just wanted Clara to know we're watching. Family looks after family. After all, if she were to send the boy to live with proper God-fearing folk, well, no one would need to bring lawyers into it." The men mounted and rode off, but their message lingered like a stain. Clara sank into a chair, hands shaking. Thomas looked up from his drawing, sensing the distress. "Mama? Who were those men?" "No one important. Sweetheart, keep drawing." Luke returned, his face grim. "He's bluffing. No judge would—" "You don't know that." Clara's voice was hollow. "You don't know what men like that can do when they set their minds to it. He turned James's whole family against me, made them believe that She couldn't finish. Luke knelt before her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Listen to me. You're under my protection now. Both of you. I won't let anyone take Thomas. You have my word." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the fierce protectiveness she saw in his eyes, but she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true. The walls she'd carefully built around her heart began to crack, letting in both hope and terror in equal measure. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the fear in Clara's heart. Spring had brought renewal to the land, but it had also brought danger to her doorstep. The fight for her son, and for the fragile new life she'd begun to build, was just beginning. The cattle rustlers struck on a moonless night in late May, when the darkness lay thick as wool over the plains. Clara woke to the sound of gunfire crackling in the distance, followed by the thunder of hooves and men shouting. She sat bolt upright, heart hammering, reaching instinctively for Thomas in the small bed beside hers. "Mama?" His voice was thick with sleep and fear. "Shh, stay quiet." She pulled him close, straining to hear over the blood rushing in her ears. Bootsteps pounded up the stairs. Clara tensed, but it was Rosa's voice that came through the door. "Senora Clara, you must stay inside. Lock the door. The men, they try to steal the cattle." Through her window, Clara could see orange muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the corrals. Luke's voice rose above the chaos, commanding his men with calm authority even as lead flew through the air. The raiders had chosen their time well. Most of the hands were at the line camps for spring roundup, leaving the main ranch defended by a skeleton crew. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes. Clara held Thomas tight, whispering prayers she hadn't said since James died. When silence finally fell, it seemed almost as ominous as the gunfire had been. She waited, hardly daring to breathe, until familiar boots climbed the stairs. "Clara, it's Luke. We've driven them off." She unlocked the door to find him standing in the hallway, hat gone, a streak of blood across his temple. Without thinking, she reached up to touch the wound. "You're hurt." He caught her hand gently. "Just a graze. We were lucky. They were after the breeding stock in the north pasture. Would have cost me 2 years' profit if they'd succeeded." "Did you lose any men?" "Sam took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll mend. Miguel's tending him now." Luke's eyes moved to Thomas, who peered out from behind Clara's skirts. "Sorry we woke you, partner. Bad men sometimes try to take what isn't theirs." "Did you shoot them?" Thomas asked with a child's directness. "We did what we had to do to protect what's ours." Luke replied carefully. "Sometimes that's what being a man means, standing up to those who would hurt the people counting on you." Clara felt the weight of his words, the way his eyes lingered on her face when he said, "people counting on you." She stepped back, suddenly aware of her nightgown and wrapper, of the impropriety of standing so close to him in the darkened hallway. "I should check on Rosa, see if she needs help with Sam," she said. "Clara," Luke's voice stopped her. "This won't be the last of it. These raids always pick up in spring. If you want to reconsider staying, we're not going anywhere." The firmness in her own voice surprised her. "Thomas and I have run enough. We stand with you. Something flared in Luke's eyes. Pride, perhaps, or something warmer. Then we stand together. The next morning brought the grim task of dealing with the aftermath. 2 rustlers lay dead in the north pasture. 3 others had fled wounded. Luke sent word to the sheriff in Willow Creek. But everyone knew the law's reach was limited on the frontier. Justice, such as it was, often came from the barrel of a gun. Clara threw herself into helping where she could, brewing willow bark tea for Sam's pain, cooking hearty meals for the exhausted men, keeping Thomas occupied and away from the grimmer sights, but she couldn't escape the worried looks the ranch hands exchanged or the way Luke doubled the night watch. A week later, she accompanied Luke to town for supplies, needing to escape the tension that clung to the ranch like smoke. Willow Creek bustled with Saturday commerce, farmers bringing goods to market, cowboys spending their pay, women examining fabric at the general store. Clara had grown used to the stares and whispers by now, but today felt different. Conversations stopped entirely when she passed Mrs. Henderson. The banker's wife actually crossed the street to avoid her. At the general store, Mr. Patterson served her with cold efficiency, none of his usual chatter. "I'll load the wagon," Luke said quietly, sensing her distress. "Why don't you take Thomas to look at the penny candy?" But even that small pleasure was denied. As Clara approached the candy jars, she heard Mrs. Brewster's carrying whisper, "Living in sin, and now men are dying at that ranch. The Lord's judgment, if you ask me. That poor child, exposed to such wickedness." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, selecting peppermints for Thomas with steady hands. It wasn't until they were back in the wagon, Willow Creek falling behind them, that she allowed her shoulders to slump. "They blame me," she said quietly. "For the raid, for the deaths, as if my presence somehow brought violence to your door." Luke's hands tightened on the reins. "Narrow-minded fools. The Cutter gang's been hitting ranches all along the Platte. Has nothing to do with you. Doesn't matter what's true, only what people believe." Clara watched Thomas, who'd fallen asleep against her shoulder, worn out from the trip. Maybe Seth Morrison won't need lawyers after all. The town will drive us out for him. "The hell they will." Luke pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "Clara, I need to tell you something. The reason I offered you work, the reason I've been so careful to keep proper distance, it wasn't just Christian charity." Clara's breath caught. "Luke, let me finish. First time I saw you, half dead in that snow, something in me recognized something in you. Not romantic foolishness, I'm too old for that. But recognition. You're a fighter. Clara Morrison. You don't give up even when giving up would be easier. Neither do I." He took a breath, looking out over the grasslands. "I built this ranch from nothing, fought for every acre, every head of cattle. I've faced down Indians, rustlers, drought, and blizzards, but I've done it alone. And lately, that victory feels hollow. Then you came along, and suddenly my house feels like a home. Thomas's laughter fills the empty spaces. Your presence at my table makes the food taste better. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give, but I want you to know you have a place at my ranch as long as you want it. To hell with what the town thinks." Clara found herself blinking back tears. No one had fought for her since James died. No one had thought her worth defending. "I'm trouble, Luke. Seth won't give up. And the town, I've handled worse trouble, and the town will come around or learn to keep their opinions to themselves." He clicked to the horses, setting them moving again. "You're not alone anymore. Clara, neither of you, accept that." That night, Clara lay wakeful despite her exhaustion. Through her window, she could see Luke making his rounds, checking on the sentries, ever vigilant, a protector, as he'd always been. But now she understood it went deeper than duty. The careful distance he maintained wasn't rejection. It was respect. He was waiting for her to be ready, to choose freely without obligation or pressure. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She'd buried her heart with James, had thought herself incapable of feeling anything beyond maternal love and basic survival. But Luke Callahan, with his quiet strength and fierce loyalty, was slowly bringing her back to life. A commotion in the yard brought her to the window. Riders approaching, but these were their own men, returning from the line camps. Luke greeted them, and even from a distance, Clara could see his relief. With the crew back to full strength, the ranch would be better defended, as if sensing her gaze. Luke looked up at her window, caught watching. Clara didn't retreat. Instead, she raised her hand in a small wave. He touched his hat brim in response, and even through the darkness, she imagined she could see him smile. The war was far from over. Seth Morrison still plotted, the town still gossiped, rustlers still threatened, and Clara's own fears still whispered that happiness was a luxury she couldn't afford. But standing at that window, watching the man who'd sworn to protect them, Clara made a decision. She would stop running, stop apologizing for surviving, stop feeling guilty for the warmth that bloomed in her chest when Luke smiled. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, she chose to believe in the possibility of a future. "We stand together," she whispered to the darkness, echoing Luke's words. And for the first time since James died, she meant it with her whole heart. The moon emerged from behind clouds, bathing the ranch in silver light. Somewhere in the distance, a nighthawk called, its cry both lonely and defiant. Clara closed the curtains and returned to bed, pulling Thomas close. They were no longer refugees seeking shelter. They were part of something now, a ranch, a community, a man's heart. The realization should have frightened her more than any rustler's bullet. Instead, she found herself smiling into the darkness, already looking forward to morning and the sight of Luke at the breakfast table, solid and sure as the mountains on the horizon. The drought began in June, creeping across the Nebraska plains like a slow-moving plague. What started as a few rainless weeks stretched into a month, then two. By August, the grass had turned from green to gold to the brittle brown of old paper. The Platte River dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the smaller streams disappeared entirely, leaving only cracked earth to mark where water once flowed. Clara stood at the kitchen pump, working the handle with increasing desperation. A few drops of rust-colored water splattered into her bucket, then nothing. The well that had served the ranch house faithfully was finally giving out, just like the other 3 wells on the property. "How bad is it?" Rosa asked from the doorway, her usual cheerful demeanor subdued by weeks of worry. "We're down to what's in the cisterns," Clara replied, calculating in her head, "maybe a week's worth if we're careful, less if we keep watering the kitchen garden." They both looked toward the small plot where Clara had coaxed tomatoes, beans, and squash from the earth. The plants drooped despite her careful tending, their leaves edged with brown. It seemed foolish to waste precious water on vegetables when the cattle were suffering, but fresh food would be scarce if the drought continued. Luke appeared around the corner, his face grim beneath a layer of dust. He'd been up since before dawn, riding the range with his men, trying to find grazing and water for the increasingly desperate herd. "We lost another 20 head, he said without preamble. "Found them piled up in Dry Creek bed. Must have been searching for water that wasn't there." Clara poured him a dipper of water from their dwindling supply. He drank gratefully, though she knew he'd given his canteen's contents to his horse hours ago. That was Luke, always putting others' needs before his own. "The Hendersons are selling out," he continued. "Banks calling in their loan. They can't keep cattle alive without water, can't pay without cattle." "Where will they go?" Rosa asked. "Back east, probably, like half the county's planning to do." Luke's jaw tightened. "But not us. This land survived droughts before. We just need to be smarter than the weather." That evening, Luke called a meeting in the main room. All the hands crowded in, their faces weathered and worried. Clara served what coffee they could spare while Luke spread out a map on the table. "There's still water in the hills," he said, pointing to the rough country northwest of the ranch. "Springs that run deeper than wells. It's a 2-day drive each way, dangerous country, but it's our best chance." Miguel frowned. "That's Apache territory. Senor, they don't take kindly to cattle on their hunting grounds." I've traded fare with Red Cloud's people before. They're reasonable if approached with respect. Luke looked around the room. I need 15 men for the drive. We'll take half the herd, the strongest ones. The rest we'll have to sell at whatever price we can get. I'll go, Clara said suddenly. Every head in the room turned to her. Luke's expression darkened. Absolutely not. You'll need every hand for the cattle. I can drive one of the water wagons. Help with cooking. Thomas can stay here with Rosa. It's too dangerous. Everything's dangerous now. Clara interrupted. Staying here with no water is dangerous. Letting you go short-handed is dangerous. I'm going— Luke! Their eyes locked across the room. A silent battle of wills. The hands shifted uncomfortably, but Clara didn't back down. She'd spent months being protected, cared for, sheltered. Now it was time to pull her weight, to prove she was truly a partner in this venture. Fine, Luke said finally. But you follow orders without question. First sign of trouble, you do exactly as told. The preparations took 2 days. Barrels were loaded onto reinforced wagons, medical supplies gathered, ammunition distributed. Thomas clung to Clara the morning of departure, trying to be brave but unable to hide his tears. You watch after Rosa, Clara told him, smoothing his hair. I'll be back before you know it, with enough water to last until the rains come. What if they don't come? Thomas whispered. Clara didn't have an answer for that, so she just held him tighter. The journey began before dawn. A long line of cattle, riders, and wagons moving northwest under a sky that seemed to mock them with its cloudless expanse. The sun rose like a malevolent eye, immediately beginning its work of sucking moisture from man and beast alike. Clara drove the chuck wagon, her hands quickly blistering despite her work-hardened calluses. Beside her rode Sam, his shoulders still stiff from the rustler's bullet but his spirits high. He taught her trail songs to pass the time, though singing made their dry throats worse. By noon, the heat was unbearable. The cattle lowed pitifully, their tongues lolling. The remuda of spare horses plodded with heads down. Men dozed in their saddles, trusting their mounts to follow the herd. Like traveling through hell, Sam muttered, squinting at the shimmering horizon. Clara had to agree. The landscape looked alien under the drought's grip, familiar landmarks transformed, distances deceptive in the heat-warped air. Only Luke seemed unaffected, riding up and down the line, encouraging the men, checking the cattle, always watching for danger. They made camp that night in a box canyon that offered some protection. Clara worked alongside Cookie, the regular trail cook, preparing a simple meal of beans and biscuit. Water was rationed carefully, a single cup per man, with the horses and cattle getting priority. Luke found her as she was banking the cook fire, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear, dry air. You did well today, he said simply. I've done harder things, she replied, thinking of the days after James died, the long walks with Thomas, the nights without shelter or food. I know. He sat beside her on a flat rock, close enough that she could feel his warmth. That's why I agreed to let you come. You're not the same woman I pulled from that snowbank. Clara, you've found your strength again. I never lost it, she corrected. Just misplaced it for a while. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Despite the hardships of the day, Clara felt a deep contentment. This was where she belonged, not in some town parlor making small talk, but out here in the wide open, facing challenges head-on. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. Luke tensed slightly, hand moving to his rifle. The drought had made all the predators desperate, more willing to risk human contact. Get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow will be harder. He was right. The second day brought them into truly rough country, steep ravines, loose shale, paths barely wide enough for the wagons. The cattle balked at the unfamiliar terrain, requiring constant encouragement to keep moving. Then they saw the smoke. It rose in a thin column from beyond the next ridge. Luke held up a hand, stopping the drive. He rode forward with Miguel and 2 others to investigate. Clara watched them disappear over the rise, her heart pounding. They returned 20 minutes later with companions, 3 Apache warriors, their faces painted for ceremony rather than war. The leader, a man about Luke's age with intelligent eyes, spoke in a mixture of English and sign language. "The springs are low," he translated for the others. "His people are also suffering, but he remembers our fair trades. We can water our cattle, but must pay fair price." The negotiation took hours. Clara watched, fascinated, as Luke and the Apache leader haggled with mutual respect. In the end, they agreed, 20 head of cattle in exchange for water rights, plus some coffee and sugar from their supplies. The springs, when they finally reached them, seemed like a miracle. Water seeped from the rock face, collecting in natural basins before trickling away into the thirsty earth. The cattle rushed forward, bellowing with relief. Men fell to their knees, drinking deeply before remembering to fill the barrels. Clara found herself crying as she watched the life-giving water flow. All the fear and tension of the past month seemed to wash away with her tears. They would survive. The ranch would survive. "No tears on the trail," Luke said softly, appearing beside her. But his eyes were gentle as he handed her his bandana. They spent 2 days at the springs, letting the cattle drink their fill, topping off every barrel and canteen. The Apache proved surprisingly friendly once the deal was struck, sharing a meal with the cowboys and trading stories. Clara learned that they too had lost people to the drought, that suffering knew no racial boundaries on the plains. The journey home was easier, despite the weight of the water wagons. Hope lightened their steps, and even the cattle seemed to sense better times ahead. They reached the ranch to find Thomas racing out to meet them, Rosa waving from the porch. "Did you bring water, Mama?" Thomas called. "Enough to last," Clara promised, swinging him up into her arms despite her exhaustion. "Enough to see us through." That night, as she tucked Thomas into bed, he whispered, "I was scared you wouldn't come back, like Papa didn't come back." Clara's throat tightened. "I'll always come back to you, always." Later, standing on the porch in the cooler night air, she found Luke beside her. Without speaking, he took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm. They stood together, looking out over the drought-stricken land that was somehow still beautiful in its harsh way. "Thank you," Luke said quietly, "for coming with us, for being who you are." Clara squeezed his hand. "Partners, remember? We stand together." The drought would continue for another month before the rains finally came. They would face more hardships, cattle prices plummeting, neighbors abandoning their claims, the constant struggle to stretch resources. But that night, with water in their barrels and hope in their hearts, Clara knew they would endure. She had traveled into dangerous territory and emerged stronger. She had proven herself not just as a survivor, but as a true woman of the frontier. And in Luke's steady presence beside her, she felt the promise of something more than mere survival, the possibility of thriving, of building something lasting in this unforgiving land. Lightning split the September sky, illuminating the prairie in stark, violent flashes. Clara smelled the smoke before she saw it, acrid and sharp, carried on the wind that had been building all day. Then came the orange glow on the horizon, growing brighter with terrifying speed. "Fire!" The cry went up from the watchtower, followed by the clanging of the warning bell. Clara rushed from the house to see a wall of flame advancing across the drought-dried grassland, driven by fierce winds. The fire moved like a living thing, leaping and dancing, consuming everything in its path. After months without rain, the prairie had become tinder waiting for a spark. Luke was already in the yard, shouting orders. "Miguel, get every man mounted. We need fire breaks along the north pasture. Sam, hitch the water wagons. Move the cattle to the east sections." "What can I do?" Clara asked, Thomas clinging to her skirts. "Get the women and children ready to evacuate if the fire break fails. Soak blankets. Gather essential supplies." His face was grim in the orange light. "If I give the word, you take Thomas and ride for the river. Don't wait for anything." Clara nodded, pushing down her fear. There was no time for it. She sent Thomas to help Rosa gather important papers and valuables while she organized the ranch women. Mrs. Patterson, the foreman's wife, took charge of soaking blankets and filling every available container with water. Cookie's daughter Mary helped Clara load medical supplies into saddlebags. The men rode out into the night, racing to create a barrier the fire couldn't cross. Clara watched them disappear into the smoke-filled darkness, her heart clenching. They would dig and burn controlled lines, trying to rob the wildfire of fuel. It was dangerous work. Men could be trapped if the wind shifted, overcome by smoke, or caught in the flames. From town came more riders, neighbors who had seen the glow, arriving to help despite months of drought-fueled tensions. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had snubbed Clara in the general store, appeared with her sons, ready to fight. "Fire doesn't care about gossip," she said curtly to Clara. "We all burn the same." Clara organized water stations for the firefighters, sending riders back and forth with fresh horses and wet blankets. The heat grew intense as the fire approached, the roar of flames mixing with the bellowing of frightened cattle and whinnying horses. Thomas worked beside her, brave despite his fear. "Will Mr. Luke stop it? Mama?" "If anyone can, he will," Clara assured him, though her own doubts gnawed at her. Hours passed in a blur of smoke and sweat. Clara's eyes burned, her throat raw from breathing the fouled air. She kept checking the horizon, watching for the signal to evacuate, but she also watched for Luke, needing to know he was safe. A rider appeared through the smoke. Sam, his face black with soot. "The fire break's holding on the north, but the wind's pushing flames toward the barn. We need every hand." Clara didn't hesitate. "Rosa, take charge here. Keep the evacuation ready." She grabbed a wet blanket and mounted her horse, following Sam into the smoke. The scene near the barn was chaos. Men beat at spot fires with wet burlap, trying to prevent embers from igniting the buildings. The main fire raged just beyond the fire break, a wall of heat and destruction held back by a thin line of burnt earth. Clara joined the battle, stamping out embers, beating back flames that tried to jump the barrier. Her world narrowed to the immediate fight. See fire. Attack it. Move to the next threat. Her hands blistered inside her gloves. Her lungs ached, but she didn't stop. Then she saw Luke, silhouetted against the inferno, trying to save the tool shed that had caught despite their efforts. He was too close to the flames, focused on his task and unaware that the fire had flanked him, cutting off his escape route. Without thinking, Clara spurred her horse forward. "Luke, behind you!" He turned, saw the danger, but it was too late to run. Clara reached him just as the flames closed in, hauling him up behind her as her horse wheeled away from the heat. They rode hard for safety, Luke's arms tight around her waist, his breath harsh in her ear. They tumbled from the horse near the water wagons, both coughing and gasping. Luke gripped her shoulders, his eyes wild with a mixture of anger and fear. "Don't you ever do something that foolish again," he said roughly. Then he pulled her against him, holding her tight. "Thank you." The battle continued through the night. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a blackened landscape, miles of prairie reduced to ash and stubble. But the ranch buildings stood intact. The firebreak had held, and most of the cattle had survived in the eastern pastures. Exhausted firefighters collapsed wherever they could find shade. Clara moved among them with water and what food they could spare, offering thanks to neighbors who had risked their lives for their ranch. The divisions that drought and hardship had created seemed petty now, faced with the democracy of disaster. Mrs. Henderson accepted a cup of water with grimy hands. "You fought well," she said quietly, "like you belong here." It was as close to an apology as Clara was likely to get, and she accepted it with grace. "We all belong here. This land makes us prove it, that's all." As the immediate danger passed, the real work began. Luke surveyed the damage with the grim expertise of a man who'd faced setbacks before. They'd lost thousands of acres of grazing land, several outbuildings, and unknown numbers of cattle scattered by the fire. "It'll be a hard winter," he said to Clara as they stood looking over the charred landscape. "No grass for grazing. Feed prices sky high if we can get it at all." "We'll manage," Clara said firmly. "We always do." Luke looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair singed, her dress ruined beyond repair. But her chin was high, her eyes determined. She'd fought beside him through the night, saved his life, proven herself in ways that no amount of words could have achieved. "Clara Morrison," he said slowly, "you are the strongest woman I have ever known." Before she could respond, Thomas ran up, throwing his arms around her waist. "Mama, I helped put out the fire by the chicken coop. Miguel said I was brave." Clara smoothed his hair, leaving new soot streaks. "You were brave, my love, just like your father would have been. Like Mr. Luke, too," Thomas added, looking up at the man with hero worship in his eyes. That evening, as the ranch slowly returned to some semblance of normal, Clara found herself standing with Luke on the porch. The sun set over the blackened prairie, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that reminded her uncomfortably of flames. "The town saw what you did tonight," Luke said, "how you fought for this place. That'll go a long way towards silencing wagging tongues." "I didn't do it for them," Clara replied. "I did it for us. For our home." The word hung between them. Home. Not Luke's home where she worked, but their home. Shared. Together. Luke turned to face her fully. "Clara, these past months, you and Thomas have become essential. Like breathing. I can't imagine this place without you in it." Clara's heart hammered, but before either could say more, a commotion in the yard interrupted. Riders approaching, too many to be casual visitors. Clara recognized Seth Morrison's bulky form in the lead, accompanied by what looked like half the town, including the sheriff. "Now what?" Luke muttered, his hand instinctively checking his sidearm. Seth dismounted with a satisfied smirk. "Came to check on my nephew after the fire. Dangerous situation for a boy. Judge Sanders here agrees it might be time to reconsider his living arrangements." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. After everything, the drought, the fire, the proof of her courage, Seth had still come to take Thomas. But this time, she wasn't facing him alone. The entire ranch crew emerged from various buildings, forming a protective semicircle. Neighbors who'd fought the fire stood witness. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "Seth Morrison, you weren't here fighting to save this boy's home, Mrs. Morrison was. I saw her risk her life tonight, just as I've seen her work herself to the bone providing for her son. Any judge worth his salt would see that." Others murmured agreement. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting this unified front. Judge Sanders, an elderly man with keen eyes, studied the scene carefully. "Perhaps," the judge said finally, "we should discuss this matter when everyone has recovered from tonight's ordeal. The boy appears safe and well cared for. I see no immediate need for intervention." Seth's face darkened. "But that's my decision, Mr. Morrison. Good evening to you all." As the unwelcome visitors departed, Clara sagged against the porch rail. Luke's hand found hers, strong and steady. "We stand together," he reminded her softly. "Always." Clara looked out over their fire-scarred land, at the people who'd become family, at Thomas chattering excitedly with Miguel about the night's adventures. They'd survived drought and flame, gossip and threats. They were battered but not broken. And in the testing, they'd been forged into something stronger. "Yes," she agreed, threading her fingers through Luke's. "Together." The fire had taken much, but it had also cleared away the dead growth of the past, leaving room for new beginnings, as the first stars appeared in the smoky sky. Clara allowed herself to believe that from the ashes of their trials, something beautiful would grow. October arrived in a blaze of gold, painting the recovering prairie with autumn's brush. where fire had blackened the earth. New grass sprouted with the determination of life refusing to yield. The first cool nights brought relief from the long drought, and morning dew sparkled like diamonds on spider webs strung between fence posts. Clara stood in the ranch's small cemetery, placing wildflowers on a makeshift memorial she'd created for James, though his body lay buried near their failed homestead. She'd needed a place to honor his memory here, in her new life. The wooden marker bore only his name and dates, but Thomas had helped her plant prairie roses beside it that would bloom come spring. "I found happiness again," she whispered to the marker. "I hope you understand." Footsteps on the dry grass made her turn. Luke approached, hat in hand, giving her the respectful distance he always maintained when she visited this spot. "Sorry to intrude," he said, "but I have something to ask you, and this seemed the right place." Clara's heart stuttered. She'd sensed this moment building for weeks, in the lingering glances, the brief touches, the way he sought her counsel on ranch matters as a true partner. Luke moved closer, his weathered face serious. "Clara Morrison, we've weathered storms together, fought fires, faced down threats. You've proven yourself braver than most men I know. Thomas has become like a son to me. This ranch feels empty when you're not in it." He dropped to one knee beside the memorial, pulling something from his vest pocket. "I'm not a man of fancy words, but I love you, Clara. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you've made my house a home. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring was simple, a gold band with a small sapphire that caught the afternoon light. Clara stared at it, then at Luke's earnest face, emotion overwhelming her. "I need to know you understand," she said softly. "Part of my heart will always belong to James. He was my first love, Thomas's father." "That won't change. I wouldn't want it to," Luke replied. "The love you bore him shaped who you are. I'm not asking you to forget him. Clara, I'm asking you to build something new with me, while honoring what came before." Clara looked from Luke to James's marker, then to the ranch buildings where Thomas was helping Miguel with the horses. Her son's laughter carried on the wind, bright and alive. This was their life now, not a betrayal of the past, but an embrace of the future. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Luke Callahan, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and rose, pulling her into an embrace that was gentle and fierce all at once. They stood together in the cemetery, life and death, past and future, all woven into a single moment of perfect understanding. Thomas's reaction exceeded even their hopes. When they told him that evening, he whooped loud enough to startle the horses and launched himself at Luke. "Can I call you Pa now?" he asked eagerly. Luke's voice was thick with emotion. "I'd be honored. Son." The wedding was set for 2 weeks hence, a simple affair at the ranch. But the preparations transformed the recovering property into a place of celebration. Rosa threw herself into cooking plans with enthusiasm that bordered on mania. The ranch hands constructed benches from salvaged lumber and strung lanterns between the buildings. Even the horses seemed to sense the excitement, prancing in their corrals with unusual spirit. News of the engagement spread quickly through the county. Most reactions were positive. The fire had shown Clara's true character, and Luke's standing in the community commanded respect. But Seth Morrison made one last attempt to cause trouble, appearing at the ranch with legal papers. "A married woman has no rights to her child if the husband chooses," he said smugly. "Sure you want to risk that, Clara?" Luke stepped forward, his presence menacing despite his calm voice. "As Clara's husband, Thomas becomes my son in all ways that matter, and I protect what's mine. Morrison, you'd do well to remember that." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise. You come near my family again, and you'll answer to me. And unlike Clara's first husband, I'm very much alive and able to defend them." Seth paled, recognizing the steel beneath Luke's words. He left without another word, the last of his power over Clara finally broken. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, with the endless Nebraska sky providing a cathedral ceiling no church could match. Clara wore her best dress, a deep blue that matched her eyes, with Rosa's lace mantilla as a veil. Thomas stood beside Luke as his best man, practically vibrating with excitement in his new suit. Friends and neighbors gathered in the yard, including many who'd once gossiped about the widow living at the Callahan ranch. Mrs. Henderson even brought a wedding cake, her way of making full amends for past judgments. Miguel played his guitar as Clara walked across the yard on Cookie's arm, the old cook having volunteered to give her away. Luke waited by the makeshift altar, his face showing the same wonder she'd seen when he first found her in the snow, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Judge Sanders, who'd refused Seth's petition, performed the ceremony. His words were simple but carried weight in their sincerity. "Marriage on the frontier isn't for the faint of heart," he said. "It requires courage, partnership, and unwavering commitment. But from what I've seen, you two have already proven yourselves in all these areas." When Luke kissed his bride, the ranch hands erupted in celebration, firing pistols into the air and cheering loud enough to stampede cattle. Thomas hugged them both, creating a circle of three that felt complete and right. The reception lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under Rosa's feast, beef from their own herd, vegetables coaxed from the garden despite the drought, pies and cakes donated by neighbor women. Musicians appeared as if by magic, and soon couples were dancing on the hard-packed earth of the yard. "Never thought I'd see Luke Callahan dancing." Sam laughed, watching his boss spin Clara with surprising grace. "Love makes fools of us all," Miguel replied sagely, though his smile was warm, as the sun set in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. Clara found herself standing with Luke on the porch, watching their guests celebrate. Thomas had fallen asleep in Rosa's lap, worn out from excitement and too much cake. "Any regrets?" Luke asked softly. Clara thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the fear, the desperate flight across frozen plains. All of it had led to this moment, to this man, to this life she could never have imagined. "Not one," she said firmly. "This is where I belong." "Where we belong," Luke corrected, pulling her closer. "The three of us." As if in response to their joy, the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of rain. Real rain. Not the teasing sprinkles they'd had, but the deep moisture smell that promised an end to the drought. Guests paused in their celebration, looking up at clouds gathering on the horizon. "Rain for a wedding means good luck, Mrs." Patterson called out. Within minutes, the first drops fell, fat, warm, life-giving, rather than flee indoors. The wedding party stood in wonder. Faces turned skyward, letting the water wash away months of dust and fear. Clara laughed as rain soaked her wedding dress, not caring one bit for the fabric. Luke spun her around, both of them giddy as children. "From snow to drought to fire to rain," he said, "we've come full circle. Mrs. Callahan." Mrs. Callahan. Clara tested the name and found it fit perfectly, like coming home after a long journey. She was no longer the desperate widow collapsed on the plains, nor the frightened woman accepting charity. She was Clara Callahan, rancher's wife, mother, survivor, and partner in every sense. The celebration continued despite the rain, perhaps because of it. After so many hard months, the people of the county needed this release, this proof that joy could still flourish in harsh lands. Music played on. Couples danced in the mud, and children splashed in rapidly forming puddles. Later, after the guests had departed and Thomas was tucked in his bed, Clara stood with her husband in their room now, not just his. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, a sound more beautiful than any symphony. "I love you, Luke Callahan," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "And I love you, Clara Callahan," he replied. "Thank you for letting me carry you into my world." She smiled at the memory of that desperate flight through the blizzard. How different from today's joyful celebration. "You saved my life that night." "No," Luke said seriously. "We saved each other." Outside, the rain continued to fall, soaking into the thirsty earth, promising new growth, new life, new beginnings. The drought was broken. The fire-scarred land would heal, and the Morrison Ranch would thrive again. But inside, in the circle of her husband's arms, Clara had already found her sanctuary. The journey from desperation to joy, from solitude to family, from mere survival to abundant life, was complete. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, ranching always did, but tonight, she was simply a woman in love, safe in her home. While the healing rain washed the world clean, the banjo's last notes had long since faded, but the music of their hearts played on, a melody of hope and happiness that would sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. For Clara and Luke Callahan, the best was yet to come. Winter arrived gently that year, as if nature itself had decided the prairie had endured enough harshness. The first snow fell in fat, lazy flakes that blanketed the recovering grassland in pristine white, unlike the killing blizzard that had brought Clara to Luke's door. This snow promised protection for the new grass beneath, insulation for the earth that had been scorched and parched. Clara stood at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching Thomas and Luke work together in the barn. Her son, their son now, had grown 2 inches since spring, his face losing its boyish roundness. He moved with Luke's same steady confidence, having learned to read the weather in cloud formations and judge cattle with a practiced eye. "You look content, Senora," Rosa observed, joining her at the window. "I am," Clara replied simply, and it was true. The desperate woman who'd collapsed in the snow 11 months ago seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood Clara Callahan, wife, mother, and full partner in one of the county's most successful ranches. The recovery from drought and fire had been swifter than anyone expected. The autumn rains had continued steady but gentle, nurturing the prairie's regeneration. Their cattle, the hardy survivors of so many trials, had thrived on the new growth. Luke's decision to crossbreed with Mexican Longhorns had proved inspired. The resulting calves were stronger, better adapted to the harsh plains. "Spring will bring a good profit," Luke had told her just last night, going over the account books together. Enough to expand the eastern sections, maybe add another well, but profit was only part of their success. The true transformation had been in their standing within the community. Clara was no longer the suspect widow living in sin, but Mrs. Callahan, respected rancher's wife. Women who'd once crossed streets to avoid her now sought her advice on everything from preserving meat to treating croup. A commotion in the yard drew her attention. Riders approaching. She recognized Dr. Patterson's buggy, followed by several neighbors on horseback. Clara dried her hands, smoothing her apron. Unexpected winter visitors usually meant trouble. But the doctor's face bore a smile when Luke helped him down from the buggy. "Mrs. Callahan, I bring news from town. The county commissioners have approved funding for a new schoolhouse, and we'd like to build it on the corner of your land, if you're willing. Central location. You see," Clara's heart leapt. A real school for Thomas and the other ranch children. No more makeshift lessons in the bunkhouse. She looked at Luke, who nodded with a smile. "We'd be honored," she said. "Education matters out here as much as water and grass." The men gathered in the parlor to discuss details while Clara and Rosa prepared refreshments. She couldn't help but remember her first weeks here, when she'd been terrified to serve coffee to the ranch hands, certain they were all judging the fallen woman in their midst. Now she moved with easy confidence, the mistress of her domain. "Mrs. Henderson sends her regards. Dr. Patterson mentioned. Says to tell you she's organizing a quilting bee next week. Hopes you'll attend." Another marker of acceptance. Clara smiled. "I'll be there." As the afternoon wore on and plans for the school took shape, Clara noticed Thomas watching from the doorway, eyes bright with interest. When the visitors departed, he rushed to her. "A real school, Ma, with books and maps and everything?" "Everything," she confirmed, ruffling his hair. "You'll learn properly now. Maybe even go to college someday. Like Pa did?" Thomas looked at Luke with adoration. Luke's expression softened in that way it always did when Thomas called him Pa. "Better than I did, I hope. You've got your mother's brains and your father's determination. You'll go far." He meant James, and Clara loved him for acknowledging it. Luke never tried to erase her first husband from their lives, but had instead woven his memory into their family story. James's photograph sat on the mantel beside their wedding portrait, and Thomas knew stories of both his fathers, the one who'd given him life and the one who'd given him a future. That evening, as snow began to fall more heavily, they gathered in the parlor as had become their custom. Luke worked on harness repairs while Clara mended clothes. Thomas sprawled on the rug with his slate, practicing letters with determined concentration. Rosa dozed in her chair, knitting needles slack in her lap. The fire crackled warmly, its light dancing across faces content with simple pleasures. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows. But inside, all was secure. The house that had once felt too large for a bachelor now seemed perfectly sized for a family. "Tell me again about finding Ma in the snow," Thomas requested, looking up from his slate. It had become a favorite story, told so often it had taken on the quality of legend. Luke set aside his work, settling back in his chair. It was the coldest night of the year. He began in his storytelling voice. "Snow falling so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I was racing home, tempest pushing through drifts tall as his chest, when something made him veer off the trail." Clara listened with half an ear, having heard it dozens of times, but she never tired of watching Thomas's face, rapt with attention even though he knew every word, or seeing Luke's eyes seek hers out during certain parts, sharing private communication that said this story was theirs alone. "A starving widow collapsed on the plains," Thomas quoted along with Luke. "But you carried her into your world." "Our world," Luke corrected gently. "She made it ours." Later, after Thomas had been tucked into bed with promises of helping with the morning feeding, Clara and Luke stood together on the porch despite the cold. The snow had stopped, leaving the ranch transformed into a wonderland of white curves and shadows. Moonlight made everything magical, ethereal. "I've been thinking," Luke said, arm around her shoulders, "about adding onto the house come spring, another bedroom or two." Clara smiled against his chest. "Planning a large family, Mr. Callahan, if you're willing, Mrs. Callahan. Thomas could use brothers and sisters." The thought of children, their children, growing up on this land filled her with warm anticipation. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their domain sleep under its blanket of snow. The barn and outbuildings stood solid against the night, monuments to their survival and success. In the distance, cattle lowed occasionally, safe in their winter pastures. All was right with their world. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Tempest hadn't veered that night?" Clara asked. "If you'd ridden past without seeing us?" Luke's arm tightened around her. "Don't think about it. Can't imagine this place without you and Thomas. You've brought life back to this ranch. Clara, before you came, I was just existing, building wealth with no purpose beyond the building. Now," he gestured at the peaceful scene, "now I have reasons for everything." Clara turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight. The harsh plains had softened since their marriage, laugh lines more prominent. The perpetual furrow between his brows smoothed away. Love had changed them both, she realized, made them more than they'd been alone. "I love our life," she said simply. "I love our family. I love you." "Forever?" he asked, though his smile said he knew the answer. "Forever," she confirmed, sealing it with a kiss. Inside, a log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney like wishes ascending to the stars. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, calving season approaching, the new school to build, the constant work of maintaining a ranch. But tonight, wrapped in her husband's arms with snow falling softly around them, Clara felt nothing but gratitude. She'd traveled such a long road to reach this moment, from Ohio to Nebraska, from wife to widow to wife again. She'd known prosperity and desperate poverty, joy and crushing grief. The frontier had tested her in every possible way, stripping away everything non-essential until only her core strength remained. And in that testing, she'd found more than survival. She'd found love that honored the past while building the future. She'd found a partner who saw her not as a woman needing rescue, but as an equal worth fighting beside. She'd found a home that was more than walls and roof, but a place where her heart could rest. "We should go in," Luke said eventually. "You'll catch cold." "In a moment," Clara replied, not ready to break the spell. She looked out over the snow-covered plains one more time, remembering that desperate night when all had seemed lost. The same landscape that had nearly claimed her life had become the backdrop for her redemption. The wilderness that had taken her first husband had given her a second chance at love. Luke was right. He'd carried her into his world that night, but together, they'd built something entirely new. Not his world or hers, but theirs. Forged in hardship and tempered by trials, stronger for having been tested. "Now," she said finally, taking his hand, "let's go home." They walked inside together, closing the door against the cold, sealing themselves into the warmth and light of the life they'd built. Behind them, snow continued to fall, covering the last traces of drought and fire, preparing the earth for spring's renewal. In the parlor, embers glowed in the fireplace like tiny beacons of hope. Clara banked them carefully, ensuring warmth would last through the night. It was a simple task, done thousands of times, but tonight it felt symbolic. They were keepers of the flame now, not just a physical fire, but of family, community, and enduring love. As she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Clara paused at Thomas's door, peering in at her sleeping son. He'd kicked off his blankets as usual, and she tucked them back around him, smoothing hair from his forehead, in sleep. He looked younger, reminding her how far they'd come from that terrified boy in the blizzard. "Thank you," she whispered to the universe, to God, to James watching from wherever souls go. "Thank you for this second chance." In their room, Luke was already in bed, waiting for her. Clara changed into her nightgown and slipped in beside him, fitting against his warmth like she'd always belonged there. Outside, the wind sang across the plains, but inside, they were safe, together. Home. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, pressing a kiss to her hair. "That I'm the luckiest woman in Nebraska," Clara replied. "Maybe in all the West." "Second luckiest," Luke corrected. "I found you first, remember?" They lay together in the darkness, listening to their house settle around them, full of contentment that went bone deep. Tomorrow would come with its duties and challenges. But tonight, they had everything that mattered, each other, their son, their land, and the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. The widow who'd collapsed on the plains had been reborn as a woman of strength and purpose. The solitary rancher who'd built an empire had discovered that success meant nothing without someone to share it. Together, they'd created something beautiful from the ashes of their separate griefs. A love story as enduring as the prairie itself, written in courage, faith, and the simple acts of choosing each other day after day. In the morning, there would be cattle to feed and chores to do, Thomas to wake for lessons and Rosa to help with breakfast. Life would continue in its rhythm of work and rest, struggle and triumph. But for now, in the quiet darkness with snow falling softly outside, Clara Callahan closed her eyes and smiled, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The American West had tested her in every way possible. It had taken everything she'd held dear, stripping her down to bare survival. But in return, it had given her more than she'd ever dared dream, a love worth fighting for, a home worth defending, and a future bright with promise from the ashes of loss. They'd built an empire of the heart, and that, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, was the greatest frontier of all. Thank you for listening to this story of love and survival in the Old West. If you enjoyed Clara and Luke's journey, we'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from, so we can connect with fellow Western romance enthusiasts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, for more authentic frontier love stories. And share your thoughts about Clara's transformation from a desperate widow to a strong rancher's wife. What part of their story touched you most? We read every comment and love engaging with our wonderful audience.